So dear colleagues, partners, listeners, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you at today's webinar. It calls our Post-Virus Future Solutions and Strategies from America, Russia, and Asia. So my name is Mikhail Krivopal. I'm a head of Academy of Management in Far Eastern Federal University and director of the Executive MBA and Master of Public Administration programs. So as a part of the National University of Singapore, university #1 in Asia, and the leading world university, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, is the partner of our programs. The school trains the next generation of Asia policymakers and leaders. Our next partner today is from the USA, is Gabelli School of Business at Fordham University in the New York City. Gabelli School prepares its graduates to be business leaders with social responsibility for both financial success and social impact. And I'm pleased to introduce our colleague from Priority Center, Language Training Center, Anastasia Kovalova, who will moderate this discussion and make this conversation even more fruitful and useful for our listeners.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you here, and we are absolutely honored to welcome James Kрэbtri in this webinar. And I'm gonna introduce James. James is a Singapore-based author and journalist, associate professor at LKYSPP, National University of Singapore, former Financial Times journalist, and advisor in the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under Toни Blэre and Gordone Braune. So, James, please welcome. We are ready. We are all ears.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's 5:30 or a little bit after 5:30 here in Singapore. And your organizers have asked me just to talk to you for a little bit about how the unfolding COVID crisis looks from Singapore. So I'm just going to share my screen for a minute. Okay, very good. So I just want to run through a couple of things. I'm open for questions on really anything at all. I mean, I've been, over the last month, as many of us have been, turning myself into a COVID studier. And so I've been looking at all sorts of different aspects of how the pandemic is unfolding in this part of the world, from China to Korea to Taiwan, here in Singapore. I'm not going to run through all of the technicalities of this, the way people have developed contact tracing apps or where each country is at. What I wanted to do was look at a couple of things. I thought I'd just talk about Singapore and how Singapore is doing, but then I wanted to look at globalization and what effect this is likely to have on the kind of models of globalization that we have gotten used to. Look at the economic recovery here in Asia and how that might pan out, and also say something about US-China and the geopolitics of this. And then we can take it from whichever way you'd like to go. So your organizers asked me to talk for about half an hour, and so I'll run through these slides, and I'll try and speak reasonably slowly for those of you who aren't native English speakers. So let me just tell you a little bit about Singapore and how Singapore has coped with this. So I first got a taste of COVID-19 way back on something like January the 24th. So Singapore began to get these cases early, and one of them, in fact, showed up in my son's school. So one of the teachers in my son's school caught COVID, and so there were emails flying around then. And so we were one of the first people to get the wave that came out of China. Singapore has since had 3 distinct waves of infections, and you can see on the graph here that the first 2, although they're not charted like this, Singapore dealt with very well. There was a wave that came from China, from Wuhan, and then a second wave which came when people came back from Singapore, mostly from Europe and the US. And then we've had a third wave, and that's where you see the spiked line go up. And that wave has been much less dealt with much less easily. So the first couple, Singapore took its place amongst the best countries in the world for dealing with this, and there was lots of praise directed at Singapore, along with countries like Taiwan and South Korea, Hong Kong to some extent, saying that Singapore dealt with things very competently, and there weren't any deaths in Singapore. There's still been almost no deaths from COVID-19. I mean, I think they're less than 20 at the moment, maybe 18 is the current figure. But what happened about a month ago was the COVID-19 found its way into the migrant worker population. So Singapore is a country of about 6 million people. So 4.5 million of those are Singaporeans, and 1.5 million, very roughly, are migrants, of which some are people like me who work in universities or banks or in financial services, and a large portion are lower skilled workers, of whom about 300,000 work in construction. They're men from mostly Bangladesh or India, southern India. And they live in, a lot of them live in worker dormitories. And the virus found its way into these dormitories and then spread with astonishing speed. And that's the spike that you can see. So at the beginning of April, there were almost no cases in these worker dormitories. And then now there's been something in the region of about 15,000. Still not very many deaths, but it's meant that Singapore has gone from being a kind of gold star, A+ responder, to one that has become more of a cautionary tale. And I say that because what we're all thinking about at the moment is, what does normality look like? What if, as we begin to relax some of these controls on social distancing? And I was asking your hosts what things were like both in Moscow and in Eastern Russia. Here in Singapore, we have quite a severe lockdown still. So we're allowed to go out to exercise and to go to the shops, but that's about it. There's only essential shops open, no businesses, no offices. So it's like Europe here at the moment, where it is really quite stringent lockdown. But as this gets relaxed, then how do we relax it in a way that doesn't mean that there will be further upsurges in the disease? And so Singapore is a cautionary warning in this respect, that even in a country that's very well organized, that has experience of dealing with pandemics of this sort, has a very competent state mostly, and has been quite innovative in some of the ways it's dealt with the pandemic, from things like contact tracing apps to other forms of monitoring and testing, that even then there was a weak spot that the virus managed to find. And so Singapore has since been struggling to bring this third wave back under control. And so for countries, including Russia, who relax their restrictions, this is the great risk that we face. How do we come up with a sustainable way of managing this pandemic that allows economic reopening and doesn't result in a cycle of gradual reopening and then resurgences of the disease, which then require further lockdowns, which have a hugely destructive effect on the economy. There you are. That's how things are in Singapore. So our we've been at home. Our university is closed. The semester is now finished, but we were online for most of the semester, as I'm sure most of you were. So let me think about East Asia more generally and what you can learn from East Asia. So I think you'll probably all be familiar with this graph, or many of you will be. This is the by now famous Financial Times flattening the curve graph, where you can see the countries that have done well along the bottom. China on the far right-hand side, simply by virtue of having started a month or two before everybody else. And then the traditionally admired European and Anglo-Saxon countries, particularly the UK and the US, that have done very badly in terms of deaths and bringing this under control. Originally, during the pandemic, there was a debate about the relative merits of authoritarian versus democratic systems. Maybe if you go back a month or 6 weeks ago, when China appeared to have suffered a lot, and other countries hadn't quite managed yet, or hadn't really got into the thick of things, there was a debate about, well, what did this tell you about the merits of authoritarian versus liberal systems, particularly given what happened in China in the early stages of the pandemic, when some information about the severity of it was hidden by the authorities in the early weeks. And so some people, particularly the Americans, think that this was a kind of critical misstep. The longer that things have gone on, however, I think it's become clear that that's not a very useful distinction. Most of the countries that have done well in handling this have turned out to be advanced democracies. Some of them have been here in East Asia, so Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, except for its most recent step, but also New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Israel. Some of the Scandinavian countries have also done very well in handling this. What seems to be the golden thread that joins these together is that they all have very high levels of state capacity, and certainly amongst the East Asian examples, they were all very well prepared for what was coming. So they had previous experience with pandemics of exactly this sort, from the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s through to Middle East respiratory syndrome. They had systems that were set up to deal with it. So South Korea, you'll have heard a lot about South Korean testing, and I spent some time trying to figure out exactly how that happened. And the point was there was already a plan in South Korea for exactly if something like this happened. And so they had regulatory systems which could be fast-tracked to allow companies who didn't make tests of these sorts to make them very quickly. So normally regulatory approval to make a testing kit takes 6 to 12 months. And the South Koreans had a plan on the books to allow them to make it in less than a week. So there were 5 companies in South Korea which were responsible for their ability to really jump up the number of tests that they were doing and subsequently export them. Some of them had regulatory approval to begin producing tests even before South Korea got its first case in the 3rd week of January. The same is true with preparedness in things like personal protective equipment and masks. So Taiwan had big stockpiles, so did Singapore. But more importantly than that, I think that these were countries that knew about diseases of this sort. So in the UK and the US and in some countries in Northern Europe, most of the experts, the scientists, the epidemiologists had lots of experience with seasonal flu, but much less with these more severe kinds of respiratory diseases. And so they coped much better. And so that combination, high state capacity, excellent medical systems, also a kind of innovative use of technology, and less of the partisan divisions that you see in the UK and the US, I think explains why these countries to some extent did better than others. If you want a little bit more about this, I'm happy to circulate. I wrote a big essay in the MIT Technology Review making this basic argument, but others have as well. So Francis Fukuyama, the famous social scientist, wrote a similar kind of piece saying state capacity as well as social trust have been important differentiators. So countries where citizens tend to trust what their governments tell them, and I would include Singapore in that, but it's certainly true of Taiwan and South Korea. It's just been much easier for the governments to get their citizens to do what they need to do, to socially isolate, to lock down, to follow instructions, to follow orders. And in America, where at least half the population at any moment doesn't trust what their political leaders are telling them, it's been much more difficult to do that, and much harder to get a kind of political consensus around the responses that are needed. So let me turn to the second thing that I wanted to talk about, which is, in a sense, what does this mean for globalization? One of the other things that joins the countries that have done well on this chart here and those that haven't is that it isn't the case that in a sense globalization is the problem here, or at least not immediately. So clearly experts on pandemics have noted that this is a pandemic very well suited to the age of globalization. So if you think of a disease like cholera was the classic disease of the period of urbanization in the 19th century, also to some degree colonialization. So cholera was previously a disease found only in parts of India, and it was only because of the British Empire that it spread to Europe. But it found its niche in urban slums. So I don't know about Moscow, but certainly in Paris and London in the middle of the 19th century, cholera took hold in these conditions. And COVID-19 clearly has spread incredibly rapidly because of the nature of global interconnection that has built up over the last 30 or 40 years. And so that has made it much more of a problem. But the countries that have dealt with it well, again, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Germany, New Zealand. These are all trading nations deeply interconnected with the global system. And so being a kind of global trading economy hasn't hampered your ability to deal with it. In fact, actually, some of these countries have dealt with it best of all. But what I think you are going to see coming out of this is it's pretty clear that the pandemic is going to accelerate a process of deglobalization that has been going on since the financial crisis. So the graph in front of you shows the red line is global GDP, leading from just before the crisis, 2018, and the blue line is growth in trade. And so you can see from the early 80s really until about the big dip in 2009, global trade grew much faster than the world economy as a whole, almost twice as fast. And so this was the era of what some people call hyperglobalization, the era of China's rise, when China entered the WTO, when you had countries like Russia as part of the BRICS grouping, when emerging markets were growing very rapidly. That stopped after the financial crisis of 2008. So you can see the blue line and the red line basically come back together again. So globalization had flatlined and in some ways had begun to decline. So international capital mobility, global trade growth all slowed. And so you had what some people call slowbalization. And I think that is now going to move forward, meaning that from a high base, we're going to have lower trade growth. We've certainly got low trade growth at the moment. We have the most crunching reduction in trade in recorded history. And I think that both in terms of trade in physical goods, but also trade in services, you're going to see barriers going up in the aftermath of COVID-19. And that means that we're not going to return to the world of hyperglobalization that we saw before that. So moving on to the next slide, the chart on the left shows these scenarios for global trade growth put out by the WTO. On the right, you can see what you're all aware of, which is that the global passenger jet flight has fallen off a cliff. So you're going to see a very marked reduction in international trade, not just in goods, as I said, but also in services. And I think it's almost inevitable that you're going to see a new wave of protectionism as well. So the big hit to trade doesn't come from protectionism, it comes from demand. So the things that are really traded in the international system, cars, washing machines, computer electronics, these are the kind of things that people stop buying in a recession. So if consumers in Moscow or London or New York stop buying all of this stuff, then countries here in Asia that produce a lot of this get hit by that. You've also had a hit to supply as well, because all these factories have been closed. But in time, I think it's almost inevitable that you have a new wave of protectionism. So that started with medical equipment, personal protective equipment, lots of export limits on that, but then it will move on to other areas. Food is one. So Russia is a big food producer, and you've seen some, I don't think Russia has done this, but Kazakhstan certainly has begun to limit exports of wheat. Some other countries, so rice, Vietnam has begun to limit exports, and that has been part of the reason why some people think emerging economies will have a food crisis. And I think the lesson of history is that in these moments, particularly when you have a downturn as severe as this, then politicians need to sort of listen to their domestic constituents. And although a protectionism at a global level is disastrous, as was true in the 1920s and early 1930s, it's very hard for political leaders not to try and provide protection to particular parts of their economy that are hurting. So let me just look at Asia's economy and how it's going to recover. So I think the longer that this has gone on, the more pessimistic people have become, unfortunately. So originally, maybe 6 weeks ago, people would have said we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. We will, have a big hit to growth, but then we'll bounce back pretty quickly and things will get back to normal. The longer that people have looked at this problem and realized how difficult it's going to be to reopen while also containing the disease, the worse the projections have become. So if you look here, I don't actually have one for Russia, I should have included, but on the right-hand side, you have the IMF projections for from 2 weeks ago, already they look pretty optimistic. So for instance, in this projection, you have a country like India, which the IMF said would grow by 2% this year. I think most Indian economists now think that that's very unlikely, and that India, having had a whole round of 3 rounds of lockdown, is now going to have a recession for the first time in recorded memory. And that's going to be true in almost all countries, maybe with the exception of China. I mean, China is in recession at the moment, but it's going to bounce back more quickly. But even China can't bounce back on its own. So if all of the places that Chinese companies are selling goods to are in recession, that becomes very difficult. The chart on the left is a little bit more confusing. It's from Nomura, but it just shows you the range of different risks that countries face. So if you look across the top of the chart, you start with COVID-19 risk, which is what are the odds that you're going to get more outbreaks, but then a whole range of other things. Do you have enough money to help your unemployed population get through this period if they lose their job? Do you have problems in your banking sector, as India does, lots of bad debts? What about corporate debt and household debt? What about your currency, particularly if the dollar strengthens? So there's a whole range of different problems here. So I think the recovery in Asia is going to look pretty uneven. And there's lots of risks of what you might think of as kind of second order effects. So even if you think you're going to deal relatively well with the pandemic, then risks of deflation, risks to your banking sector. What about your corporates? I mean, you've seen a whole range of companies, big name companies in the US over the last couple of days having to lay off large chunks of their workforce, like Airbnb and Uber, the airlines. But this is going to be true all over the rest of the world as well, with slightly less famous names. That companies that have taken on lots of debt in good times are now struggling to repay and have to really change the way that their businesses operate, which I know will be something that will be of interest to your students. Here's one other point, which is about the emerging markets in particular. And this, I think, is where I'm particularly downbeat. So at the moment, you have a kind of conundrum, which is that most of the pandemic, the countries that have been worst hit have been rich countries. So rich countries in China. So that's partly why the global economic hit is so bad, that if you have these slowdowns or these lockdowns in China, the US, and Europe, these are the world's biggest economies, and they take up 3/4 of the world economy. And so that's why the hit has been so bad. But the real problem, I think, in the medium to long term, and this does unfortunately include Russia, is going to be in emerging markets. So if you think back before the financial crisis, the idea of the BRICS, the idea there was that you had emerging markets, not just Russia or Brazil or India, but a whole range of emerging markets who were going to grow much more quickly than historically countries had been able to, and that growth was going to power them through becoming middle income and becoming rich, advanced industrial countries. I think that's much more difficult to imagine in the aftermath of COVID, and that's partly because what I talked about before, that if you don't have globalization, in a sense, helping to provide that lift, as it did for countries like China, providing export markets, providing demand for products, then it's hard to grow anywhere near as quickly as many of these countries have in the past. It's doubly difficult if you're a commodity producer. So Russia is an oil producer, Brazil is an iron ore producer, Indonesia produces coal. Obviously, demand for commodities has fallen off a cliff. It's hard if you don't have good finances, and unfortunately, a lot of the major emerging markets do have quite problematic public finances. So they took on a lot of debt in the good times. They don't have the kind of huge financial reserves. So a country like Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, in particular, I mean, all of these countries look quite precarious at the moment. They've been saved by action by the US Federal Reserve to some degree that has pumped a whole lot of money into the international financial system. So we haven't had a crisis yet. But the risk of one, I think the longer this continues, it's going to be very hard for emerging markets. It's also going to be very difficult for them to control the outbreak. So in theory, at least, countries like South Korea have these states, well-functioning states with high state capacity, which can at least have a hope of managing the pandemic, try to keep it under control. But as Singapore showed, even that's very difficult. But in a country like India, it's really hard to imagine that happening easily. And so although actually India hasn't been hit as badly as many people feared, it's going to be a long road ahead, a couple of years at least, before you have a vaccine that is widely available that can inoculate a whole population. And so it's going to be very tough for these kinds of countries to manage that process. Not impossible. I mean, some countries have done much better than you would have expected, but it's going to be hard. So what are you going to see out of this? And let me turn to the third point, and then I'll close, which is to look at US-China and what this is going to mean geopolitically. So you already see quite a lot of pressure in the West, so in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, to begin to diversify supply chains. So over the last 30 years, you've seen a lot of companies from the rich world set up operations here in Asia. So that's what globalization has really been about, the core of it. So you took things that used to be produced in countries like Japan or Germany or the US, and you move large chunks of that first to Singapore and South Korea. Some of your students who came to the Lee Kuan Yew School, this is what I talked to them about. I don't know if any of them are on the call, but we talked about the history of economic development in East Asia and how that had worked and built up the age of globalization. Now, there's a lot of political pressure now to unwind some of this. You hear about decoupling between the US and China. You can see on the screen a story from yesterday or the day before about Trump administration officials talking about ripping out supply chains from China. And so companies are going to be looking at their supply chains and thinking, well, can we diversify to reduce risk of something like this happening again? Japan has set up a fund to help its companies move out of China. There's going to be pushes from both the US and Europe. This is particularly true in areas like technology, so you should see even more focus on companies like Huawei, Chinese companies. So this process in which companies were able easily to create supply chains in Asia is going to become much more difficult. That doesn't mean you're going to see a collapse in globalization. I mean, if this crisis has told us anything, it's very hard to do anything without China or without Asian production. So all sorts of things that no one had ever thought about before, masks, personal protective equipment, it turns out they're all made either in China or in parts of emerging Asia. And there's no real way around that. It's not plausible to imagine all of these things suddenly being made in France or Germany. But I think you are going to see some interesting trends emerging in this part of the world. So to go through these four pictures, the first is that you're going to see countries classifying what counts as strategic industries. So clearly medical equipment is going to be seen as strategic, and there'll be a big push to make the kinds of things we all wish we had 2 or 3 months ago at home, or at least to ensure that you have guaranteed supplies, so more stockpiles like the Swiss have. You're also going to see a move towards regionalization of supply chains. So even global companies are going to set up, that they'll have, instead of having global supply chains, they'll have some in Europe, some in America, some in Asia as a hedge. So for instance, you might move some production to Mexico or some production to Poland. So less complicated, more regional supply chains. And that fits into various other economic trends that we see. So making things closer to final markets makes sense. And that also makes sense in Asia as well. When you have a rising middle class in Asia and you want to make products for them, it makes sense to make more of that in Asia. You're also going to see an acceleration of digitalization. So in a sense, moving physical goods around the world is less important than it used to be. But out of this crisis, you've seen the critical importance of technological infrastructure. You realize you don't actually have to go into your office to do work. You've seen that healthcare can be delivered online much more effectively than we thought we could, education as well. And so there'll be a shift away from physical trade towards digital trade. And I think you'll also see an acceleration of what some people call techno-nationalism, of trying to protect digital champions of putting restrictions, Americans putting restrictions on Chinese companies putting restrictions on American companies, the rise of a technological world that has different spheres as well, an American one, a European one, a Chinese one. And so here in Southeast Asia, I think it's sort of inevitable really that you're going to see Southeast Asia drawn more closely to China in the aftermath of this. Let me just sort of close on China and say, so where does this leave China? Clearly, America is relatively weakened coming out of this crisis, and the way America has responded to this has been fairly shambolic, and so in all sorts of different ways, economically, but also in terms of the way people view the country, America has taken a huge hit. China, I think, is a much more ambiguous case. So in some ways, China has come out of this relatively strongly. It has brought the disease under control. And while the political risks to Xi Jinping were substantial, in some ways, the government has turned round the crisis in a way that has allowed them to say that China has been, in a sense, an exemplary global citizen. On the other hand, it's still a very risky period. So China has very carefully managed its economic growth for a generation, bringing it down from 10% to 9% to 8%, now to 6%. But now it has a recession on its hands. It still has lots of internal problems. It has protests in Hong Kong. It has the success of Taiwan in this crisis. It has an economic outlook that is risky. And I think it's realized that it has alienated a lot of countries around the world. So there's a backlash you can see in the story from yesterday, a backlash against China, not just in the US, but in Europe and in other countries, including India, some others in Asia, that is going to be quite damaging for Beijing. And also, if you think about something like the Belt and Road Initiative, the very expensive infrastructure funding program that has been Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy endeavor, it's much harder to see when there's no money how you can continue in the same way. Also, they lent a lot of money to countries that are now not going to be able to repay them. And so even that, so China's role in the world has been brought into question as you've had lots more scrutiny. So I think the position that China finds itself on is still a very precarious one. It's dealt with this crisis clearly much better than the United States. And so in Asia and in Southeast Asia, I think China emerges relatively stronger, but its economic position in the medium term is very weak. And it has to deal with the fact that a lot of countries in Europe and also particularly in North America that have become much more skeptical of China's role, and that's going to be complicated. So that's it. Those were the three things that I wanted to talk about. I don't think I've gone over my time. I'm happy to talk about anything that you'd like. If you want to keep in touch, feel free to add me on LinkedIn, and I can talk about anything that you like. Although unfortunately, I don't speak a word of Russian, so I'll have to do the best I can without that, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, James, so much for this overlook, globalization and all these questions covering the current situation. Now we're gonna go through some questions from our participants here. Like, you've told a lot about, not a lot, but you've told a little about Korea, South Korea, and their experiences, their like preventive measures. And here's the question from one of us. What is the advantage of South Korea? So few COVID-19 cases. Are Koreans very disciplined, always keeping a distance? Government actions, what's their secret?
Yeah, I tend, so there is some people look at cultural explanations for this, talk about Confucian democracy, the notion that in East Asia, people are just very well behaved and they do what they're told. I tend not to think that that's a very useful explanation for this, although it is part of it. I think more in South Korea. So you had, firstly, country was very well prepared. They've had crises of this sort before. They have an excellent healthcare system. I mean, if you look at the number of intensive care beds per capita, South Korea does very well. As I said in the presentation, they particularly had planned out what to do because they recognized how important testing was. in the end, the big problem that the Western countries have had is if you can't test and find out who's got the disease, you can't track it, you can't find out what's going on, and so you're sort of left blind. And so in a country like Britain, it wasn't really possible. They didn't have capacity to do contact tracing. So if you found out who had the disease, could you then find out all the other people they'd been in contact with? But you couldn't even test these people to find out if they had it or not. And so in South Korea, they had a plan for that, that they were able to roll out very, very quickly. And they also had an industrial base that, not every country has biotech companies, 24 biotech companies that you can repurpose to suddenly start making tests. And so in that sense, South Korea was just lucky. It was one of there really only, these tests are produced in predominantly only 3 countries, in South Korea, in China, and in the United States. And so South Korea happened to have the kind of companies that you needed. And South Korea also has, it's a very technologically advanced society. And so once you had that testing, you could do things with it. So one of the interesting things has been the South Korean mapping apps. So if you are in South Korea, you'll have an app on your phone, and that you can look on your phone and find out if anybody who has tested positive for COVID-19 has been anywhere in the country. So you just look at a map of, let's say, a street in Vladivostok, and you can see which people who tested positive for COVID-19 have been on which streets or been to which restaurants. And so because they had this information, they had the testing, they then made that information very widely publicly available. So in previous pandemics, some of these East Asian democracies were criticized for hiding the true extent of the pandemic, of not being open with the amount of information that they gave. This time, they've behaved quite differently. They've been quite open. This has been particularly true in Taiwan and South Korea. And they put all this data out there, and so technology developers came along and made apps or websites out of this. So in Taiwan, for instance, there was a very popular app which could tell you where you could get masks. So everyone was allowed to get masks. And there was an app which told you where you could go to get a mask, which shops, which pharmacies had masks at any moment. In South Korea, they had these mapping apps which allowed you to see where people who had the COVID had been, and that meant that you could, you could avoid these areas if you wanted to. If you had been somewhere where people with the disease had been, then you could self-isolate, or you could go and get a test. And the tests were very easily available. You've got drive-through testing, you had pop-up tests on the street. They also have a kind of very simple, a technological infrastructure using SMS. So in Singapore, everybody uses WhatsApp, and the government has a WhatsApp announcement system where you get messages from the government every day telling you what's happening. In South Korea, it's been old-fashioned text messages. And so there was a case where 21 sailors were infected with COVID about 3 weeks ago. And they came off their ships and they went all the way around Taiwan. This wasn't in South Korea, this was in Taiwan. And the government sent text messages to 200,000 people who had been in the same area as these 21 soldiers and told them to go and get tested or to self-isolate. So these are the kind of things that these countries have been able to do because they have well-prepared, technologically advanced states that have been able to respond quickly to this outbreak. And South Korea, if you look at it, the number of tests that South Korea has administered is actually quite small, much less than in the UK or the US. But the point was they were able to do it quickly. They did it within the first 2 or 3 weeks. They were able to increase capacity. And that meant they were able to bring things under control. So they haven't actually needed to do millions and millions of tests because they were able to do it much more quickly. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Just all the questions covered about Korea, South Korea. Thank you so much. Like technological advances defined actually the speed of realizing the campaign. So the question here we go: where does Russia see its role in the new world after COVID?
This is what's Russia's role in the world after COVID? Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on Russian internal politics, so I get everything that I read from the biased Western media. The biased Western media is telling me that Mr. Putin is much less popular than he used to be, and that Russia's outbreak of COVID is one of the more severe amongst the major emerging markets. I mean, I think what I would say is that what we will see out of this are two big trends, some of which might be to Russia's advantage, which is that, you know, we're moving into a world in which multilateralism is going further out of fashion. So you've seen the global response to this has been relatively weak. It's been very hard for multilateral institutions to operate, whether that's the World Health Organization or the G20. The G20 was the body that dealt reasonably well with the 2008 crisis and has operated much less effectively this time around. Also true for the G7. And so, you know, we're moving towards a world in which multilateral organizations have less power, and therefore, you know, large powers have more room for maneuver. And so I suspect that if you're Mr. Putin, you may think that this is probably quite a good thing, because it opens a space for great power diplomacy. So that's on the geopolitical side. Equally, if the US and China are scrapping with one another, then that gives other regional powers, kind of the other big powers like Russia and India and Japan, more space to operate. But economically, I think the situation still looks pretty bleak. I mean, I don't want to repeat myself. I think it's hard for emerging markets now to tell international investors that they're going to grow much more quickly than they did in the past. A lot of them have taken on debt on the assumption of growth rates that now look unrealistic. A lot of them have core industries that are going to really struggle. So, you know, Russia is an oil and gas exporter. This is clearly a very bad time to be an oil and gas exporter. And so there are lots of domestic challenges that come with what effect that will have on your public finances. And so it's going to be much harder. If you think about a country like China, so China is going to be one of the best prepared of the emerging markets, but still the social contract between the Chinese leadership and its people was based on an assumption that, you know, we will forego some of our civil liberties and you will deliver us rises in material prosperity that the middle class wanted to become more prosperous. That's going to be more difficult at least in the immediate term, and I fear in the medium term as well. And so I think Russia will have to grapple with these two trends, that global economic growth is going to be lower and trade is going to be lower, and that's going to make it more difficult for emerging markets like Russia, and the geopolitical context is going to be more complicated.
Yeah, it's just
Anastasia, could I put a question to James?
Sure.
Thank you. James, for you as an academic, I want to ask you a question. Of course, we all know that governments all over the world being criticized per their population and citizens, and probably you won't find a single country in the world where the ratings of administrations went up after COVID-19. But for you as an academic, again, I want to put a question. Do you think that governments all over the world, and if there are some, give us an example, were prepared in this situation and reacted properly? Do you see any kind of those examples?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting.
According to what you just said about the social contract, because I'm going to talk about that a little bit more precisely.
So the first thing I should say is I'm not really an academic. My background is in journalism and policy, so I'm a kind of pretend professor. But yeah, I mean, so I don't want to keep going on about South Korea, but if you look at South Korea, they had an election a month ago in which the governing party under Moon Jae-in won a huge victory simply because the public had thought that that he had managed the crisis very well, and so he won a historic landslide. So there's been a real divergence in the way that publics have looked at their government. So a little bit after a terrorist attack or in wartime, the initial reaction that most people have is to support their governments in these moments. Initially, this is a national crisis. So even in a country like the UK, which has done pretty badly out of this, the popularity of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has gone up. Trump's popularity, despite how badly he's handled it, hasn't actually gone down very much. I mean, maybe just a little bit. It looks like Joe Biden is ahead in that race. If you look at a country like New Zealand, then Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, is very popular. And so I think if in the initial stages, your government is perceived to have handled this well, if you are Angela Merkel, for instance, then your poll ratings rise and people give you the benefit of the doubt. And even if you've handled it badly, for some period of time, the people sort of give you the benefit of the doubt because they see, well, this isn't really anybody's fault. This isn't like this is a sort of like an act of God. The problem then comes, this is going to go on for a long time and people have short patience. So as the economic downturn bites, as you have historically high levels of unemployment, then I think it's going to be much harder to stop a backlash, and that's going to be bad enough in rich countries who are able to some degree to cushion the blow by providing unemployment insurance and giving cash loans to small businesses. I mean, I should say that's one of the things that actually has been most positive out of this crisis, that we really have learned a lot of the lessons from 2008-9. So you've seen very unusual, extraordinary action from the big central banks and also a lot of governments in the rich countries who've really just opened the spending floodgates in exactly the way that you need to in these circumstances. So we haven't had this kind of orthodox reaction. But in emerging markets, that's much more difficult. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Lebanon at the moment, other countries in the Middle East, in Latin America, which we haven't talked about, there's going to be an awful lot of, it's going to be hard to avoid public resentment. And there's all sorts of things that will flow from that. So if you were sitting in Europe at the moment, I think you'd be very worried, not just about the economic after effects of this, but another migration crisis is really quite likely over the next couple of years as people move out of either Africa and over the Mediterranean or out of the trouble spots in the Middle East. If you have the same circumstances and then a big economic recession, there's all sorts of spillover effects that have to be managed. So I mean, I think, Sergey, your question is a very good one. There definitely are circumstances in which a crisis like this can help political leaders because their publics rally around them. It's more the long term that I'm thinking about, that if you have a grinding economic downturn that lasts for 2 or 3 years, then sustaining that popularity throughout that is very difficult.
Okay, just we'll continue. When you are ready, please welcome. There was a question which we didn't have. Russia and China relations has been warming in recent years. How does Russia see this relationship going forward?
Gosh, that's a tough one. I think I should ask Sergey this. I mean, I think China is going to be looking for friends. If you're sitting in Beijing at the moment, as I said, you have this big backlash. China has tried to build all sorts of relationships over the last decade. So it has recognized that it has a competition with the US, but it has tried to build relationships in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, and it's done a lot of work trying to build ties with Russia as well, through energy diplomacy in particular, but also through defense and in other areas. I don't get the sense that, in a sense, Russia is part of this group of countries in which I would include most of the European countries, America and India, and some in Asia like Japan and Vietnam, that have, in a sense, had a backlash against China and therefore will be more skeptical about China's role in the world in the aftermath of this. So I think, in a sense, my gut instinct would be that Sino-Russian relations will probably improve in the aftermath of this, relatively speaking. But beyond that, again, I'm not an expert on that. We should probably ask Sergey that a little bit further down the road.
Yeah, sure. And getting back to Singapore questions, what can we expect to see in Singapore's job market and economic outlook?
Not good, I'm afraid. So Singapore, the upside is that Singapore has been very aggressive in terms of its support, fiscal support. So its treasury minister is traditionally a very fiscally conservative country, so it doesn't have a big welfare state and tends to be very worried about spending too much money. But this time they've spent a lot of money. But Singapore is a very trade-dependent economy. It's often called the canary in the coal mine, meaning it's an early warning of problems to come in the global economy because it has a trade to GDP ratio of 200%. So it's one of the most trade-dependent economies in the world. And at the moment, its economy is, so if the global economy is suffering, Singapore is going to suffer too. So what that means precisely for its job market, I'm not entirely sure, but it will certainly be bad, and there will be a big recession here, simply because it's so trade dependent. But you know, Singapore is a rich country, has big reserves, and so it will be able to weather this storm much more easily than most. More worrying is the position of other poorer trade-dependent exporting economies around Southeast and East Asia, that they'll be more vulnerable because they don't have the kind of resources that Singapore has.
Thank you so much, James. We have to proceed to the next speaker. That was like really effective, interesting. Probably like if we have some time at the end of all the session, maybe we'll have a chance to talk to 3 of our experts, and like we'll get a global outlook on everything we've said today. James?
Let me just say before I go that I'm going to stick around and listen to Sergei, but then at some point I have to disappear because I have my children at home and I have to go and feed my children dinner. So if I disappear, I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me, but I'm looking forward to listening to Sergei as well. So